The sun rises over Dodge City, Kansas, 1878. You step off the train, dust settling on your modern sensibilities like a death shroud. Within minutes, you're overwhelmed by the stench of unwashed bodies, horse manure, and rotting meat. A drunk cowboy stumbles past, his breath reeking of rot-gut whiskey, a Colt 45 hanging loose at his hip. You've been in the Wild West for exactly 7 minutes, and you're already calculating your life expectancy in hours, not years. Welcome to America's most romanticized nightmare, where your smartphone can't save you, your college degree means nothing, and death lurks behind every saloon door, trading post, and prairie sunset. The Wild West wasn't the Hollywood fantasy of noble gunfighters and honorable outlaws. It was a brutal, unforgiving frontier where civilization was a thin veneer over raw human savagery, where justice came from the barrel of a gun, and where most people died young, dirty, and forgotten. If you think you could survive even a single day in this hellscape, you're about to discover just how wrong you are. Let's start with your first challenge, staying alive long enough to find shelter. The moment you set foot in any frontier town, you become a target, not because you're particularly threatening, but because you're obviously not from around here. Your clean clothes, soft hands, and confused expression mark you as fresh meat. For every con artist, pickpocket, and murderer looking for an easy score, take Tombstone, Arizona, in 1881. The town had a population of about 14,000 people, but it averaged 1 murder every 10 days. That's not counting the deaths from disease, accidents, or the countless people who simply disappeared into the desert, never to be seen again. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral wasn't an anomaly. It was just Tuesday in Tombstone. Your modern instincts would get you killed within hours. You'd probably try to find a hotel, not realizing that most frontier accommodations were flea-infested. Hovels where you'd be lucky to wake up with all your possessions, let alone your life. The bed you'd sleep in might have been vacated by someone who died of cholera the night before, and the sheets, if there were any, hadn't been washed in months. But let's say you somehow avoid the immediate dangers of arrival and find a place to sleep. The real nightmare begins when you wake up and realize you need to eat. Forget about your dietary restrictions, your gluten sensitivity, or your vegan lifestyle. In the Wild West, you ate what was available, and what was available was usually rancid, contaminated, or crawling with insects. A typical meal might consist of hardtack biscuits so tough they could break your teeth, salt pork that had been cured months ago and was now more green than pink, and coffee made from beans that had been ground with whatever was handy, including dirt, insects, and occasionally horse manure. Fresh vegetables were virtually non-existent, which meant scurvy was common. Fresh meat often came from animals that had died of disease or had been killed days earlier in the blazing heat without proper refrigeration. Water was perhaps the greatest killer of all. The pristine mountain streams and clear rivers you see in movies were actually sewage systems for every town, mining camp, and cattle drive upstream. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever spread through water supplies like wildfire. Even if you were smart enough to boil your water, the fuel to maintain a fire was often scarce and expensive. Let's talk about the weather, because Mother Nature in the Wild West was trying to kill you as actively as any outlaw. Summers on the Great Plains regularly reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit, with no shade, no air conditioning, and no relief. Heat stroke was a death sentence, and dehydration could kill you in hours. The sun was so intense it could literally cook. Exposed skin, and many settlers developed skin cancers that would eat away at their faces until they died in agony. Winters were equally deadly, but in the opposite direction. Temperatures could drop to 40 below zero, and blizzards would trap people in their homes for weeks at a time. Frostbite was common, often leading to amputations performed without anesthesia by whoever happened to have the sharpest knife. The famous winter of 1886-1887 killed an estimated 90% of the cattle on the northern plains, and thousands of people who froze to death in their homes, their bodies not discovered until spring. But weather was just the opening act. The real stars of this deadly show were the diseases that swept through frontier communities like the angel of death. Smallpox, tuberculosis, pneumonia, and influenza ran rampant in communities with no understanding of sanitation or medical science. A simple cut could become infected and kill you within a week. Broken bones often healed wrong, leaving people crippled for life. Dental problems were solved with pliers and whiskey if you were lucky. Childbirth was a death sentence for many. Women, with no sterile conditions, no trained doctors, and no understanding of basic medical hygiene, maternal mortality rates were astronomical. Even if a woman survived giving birth, the infant mortality rate was over 25%. Families routinely lost multiple children, and it was common for people to have 10 or more siblings they'd never met because they died before their first birthday. Medical care, when it existed at all, was primitive and often more dangerous than the ailment it was supposed to treat. Doctors, trained by reading books and practicing on whoever was desperate enough to let them. Surgery was performed without anesthesia, antibiotics didn't exist, and the most common treatment for any serious illness was bloodletting, which often killed patients faster than their original disease. Patent medicines were popular, but most were just alcohol mixed with opium, cocaine, or other dangerous substances. These miracle cures created armies of addicts and killed thousands of people who thought they were getting medicine. The lucky ones just lost their money. The unlucky ones lost their lives. Now let's discuss the human element, because if disease and weather didn't kill you, your fellow human beings certainly would. The Wild West attracted the dregs of American society. Criminals fleeing justice, psychopaths looking for victims, and desperate people willing to do anything to survive. Murder was so common that many towns didn't even bother investigating unless the victim was someone important. Take someone like John Wesley Hardin, who claimed to have killed 42 men before his 25th birthday. Or Clay Allison, known as the gentleman gunfighter, who once dug up a dead man to decapitate the corpse because he was unsatisfied with the original killing. These weren't aberrations. They were typical examples of the kind of people you'd encounter daily. Violence was the primary means of settling disputes. Courts were rare, law enforcement was minimal, and vigilante justice was the norm. If someone accused you of cheating at cards, stealing a horse, or looking at their woman wrong, you might find yourself at the business end of a rope or a bullet, with no trial and no appeal. The famous fast-draw gunfights were mostly Hollywood invention, but people did kill each other with guns constantly. Most shootings happened at close range, often in the back, and usually over trivial disputes. Arguments over card games, property lines, water rights, or simple insults regularly ended in death. Even if you managed to avoid the obvious killers, you'd have to deal with con artists, thieves, and swindlers who made their living separating fools from their money. Three-card Monte games, rigged gambling, fake land deals, and bogus mining claims were everywhere. Lose your money, and you'd find yourself destitute in a place where poverty was often a death sentence. Let's examine a typical day in your hypothetical Wild West experience. You wake up in a flea-infested bed, assuming you weren't robbed or murdered during the night. Your first task is finding breakfast, which means venturing into the street where you'll immediately be overwhelmed by the stench. Human and animal waste lined the streets because there were no sewage systems. Dead animals were left where they fell until they rotted away or were eaten by scavengers. The noise would be deafening and alien to modern ears. Gunshots were as common as car horns are today, but each one might signal someone's death. Drunken. Brawls started before noon and continued until people passed out or died. Animals squealed as they were slaughtered in the streets. and the screams of people being beaten, whipped, or worse were just part of the ambient sound. You'd need to buy supplies, but prices were astronomical and quality was abysmal. A single egg might cost the equivalent of $20 in today's money. A pound of flour could cost $50. And these weren't organic, free-range products. They were often spoiled, contaminated, or adulterated with dangerous substances to increase profits. Employment opportunities were limited and dangerous. You could work in the mines where cave-ins, explosions, and toxic gases killed workers regularly. The average life expectancy of a miner was about 5 years after starting work. You could join a cattle drive where you'd spend months in the saddle, eating terrible food, drinking poisoned water, and facing constant threats from stampedes, storms, and hostile encounters. Maybe you'd consider farming, but homesteading was perhaps the most dangerous occupation of all. You'd be completely isolated, miles from any help, facing not just the environmental challenges, but also conflicts with Native American tribes who were rightfully defending their ancestral lands from invasion. The Indian Wars were brutal affairs where atrocities were committed by all sides. Entire families were wiped out in raids, and the frontier was littered with burned homesteads and unmarked graves. The famous battles like Little Bighorn were just the tip of the iceberg. Smaller conflicts claimed thousands of lives that history never bothered to record. Even in relatively safe occupations, death lurked everywhere. Shopkeepers were robbed and murdered regularly. Blacksmiths died from burns, cuts, and lung diseases caused by constant exposure to smoke and metal dust. Barbers doubled as surgeons and dentists, spreading disease through contaminated instruments. Saloon keepers lived in constant fear of drunken gunfights that could erupt without warning. Speaking of saloons, these weren't the friendly neighborhood bars portrayed in movies. They were violent, lawless places where arguments were settled with bullets and knives. The whiskey was often toxic, literally poisoning customers with methanol and other dangerous chemicals. Prostitution was rampant, spreading syphilis and other venereal diseases that could drive people insane or kill them slowly and painfully. Gambling was crooked, fights were common, and cheating was expected. If you won too much money, you might not live to spend it. If you accused someone of cheating, you might not live to see sunrise. The famous poker games where fortunes were won and lost were often rigged affairs designed to separate suckers from their cash. Let's not forget about transportation, because getting from one place to another was a deadly adventure in itself. Stagecoaches were regularly robbed by highwaymen who thought nothing of killing passengers to eliminate witnesses. The coaches themselves were death traps that regularly overturned, crushing passengers or throwing them off cliffs. If you rode horseback, you faced the constant threat of being thrown, trampled, or having your horse stolen, which could be a death sentence if you were stranded in hostile territory. Horses were valuable, and horse theft was often punishable by hanging, but that didn't stop desperate people from stealing them. Railroad travel, when available, wasn't much safer. Train robberies were common, derailments killed passengers regularly, and the primitive safety systems meant that accidents were often catastrophic. The Transcontinental Railroad was built on the bones of workers who died from explosions, cave-ins, and industrial accidents. Even communication was dangerous. The mail was unreliable and often stolen. Telegraph lines were constantly cut by hostile tribes, outlaws, or simple vandalism. If you needed help, you were often completely on your own, with no way to call for assistance and no guarantee that help would come, even if you could send for it. Let's examine the legal system, or lack thereof. In many frontier towns, law enforcement consisted of one sheriff and maybe a deputy, both of whom might be corrupt, incompetent, or simply outgunned by the criminal element. Courts were irregular, judges were often unqualified, and juries could be intimidated or bought. Justice was often administered by vigilance committees, which were essentially lynch mobs that operated under the pretense of law and order. These Groups regularly hanged innocent people based on suspicion, personal grudges, or simple prejudice. Being accused of a crime was often tantamount to a death sentence, regardless of actual guilt or innocence. The famous hanging judges like Isaac Parker weren't just Hollywood creations. Parker sentenced 160 people to death during his tenure in Arkansas, and many frontier judges saw execution as the solution to most criminal problems. Due process was a luxury that few could afford, and legal representation was often non-existent. Women faced additional challenges that would horrify modern sensibilities. They had virtually no legal rights, could be beaten by their husbands with impunity, and faced constant threats of sexual violence. Rape was common and rarely prosecuted, especially if the victim was poor, Native American or Mexican. Women who traveled alone were assumed to be prostitutes and treated accordingly. Prostitution was one of the few ways women could earn independent income, but it was dangerous work. Prostitutes were regularly beaten, robbed, and murdered by customers. Venereal diseases were rampant, and medical treatment was non-existent. Most prostitutes died young from disease, violence, or suicide. Even respectable women lived lives of constant hardship. Childbirth could kill them, domestic violence was accepted, and they were expected to work from dawn to dusk, maintaining households without modern conveniences. Washing clothes meant hauling water, building fires, and using lye soap that could burn their hands. Cooking was done over open fires that regularly caused fatal burns. Children in the Wild West faced their own special horrors. Child mortality was so high that many parents didn't bother naming children until they were sure they would survive their first year. Children worked dangerous jobs in mines, factories, and farms. Education was sporadic at best, and many children grew up illiterate. Orphans were common, and orphanages were often worse than the streets. Children were regularly sold into virtual slavery, sexually abused, or simply abandoned to fend for themselves. Child labor was not just accepted, but expected, and workplace accidents claimed young lives regularly. The few schools that existed were one-room affairs where a single teacher tried to educate children of all ages simultaneously. Violence was common in schools, both from teachers who used corporal punishment liberally and from older students who bullied younger ones mercilessly. Let's talk about the economic realities of frontier life. The boom and bust cycles were extreme and unpredictable. Mining towns would spring up overnight when gold or silver was discovered, then become ghost towns just as quickly when the ore played out. People who thought they were rich on Monday might be destitute by Friday. Banking was primitive and unreliable. Banks failed constantly, taking depositors' life savings with them. There was no deposit insurance, no government regulation, and no recourse when financial institutions collapsed. Many people kept their money in cash, making them targets for robbery and theft. Credit was expensive when it was available at all. Interest rates of 25 to 50% were common, and failure to pay debts could result in debtor's prison or worse. Sharecropping and company stores created systems of virtual slavery where people worked their entire lives without ever getting out of debt. Employment was uncertain and seasonal. Cowboys worked during cattle drives, but might be unemployed for months between jobs. Miners worked when claims were productive, but faced unemployment when mines played out. Farmers were at the mercy of weather, insects, and market fluctuations that could destroy years of work in days. The infrastructure we take for granted simply didn't exist. There were no paved roads, no streetlights, no traffic signals. Travel was slow, dangerous, and expensive. A journey that takes hours today could take weeks in the 1800s, assuming you survived it at all. Sanitation was non-existent in most places. Garbage was thrown in the streets. Human waste was dumped wherever convenient, and dead animals were left to rot where they fell. Disease spread rapidly through these conditions, and epidemics could wipe out entire communities in weeks. Fire was a constant threat because most buildings were wooden, and firefighting capabilities were primitive. Entire towns regularly burned to the ground, destroying not just buildings, but also the lives and livelihoods of everyone who lived there. Chicago's Great Fire of 1871 was just the most famous example of urban conflagrations that happened regularly. Throughout the frontier, let's examine some specific examples of how ordinary activities could kill you in the Wild West. Taking a bath was risky because most people bathed in rivers or streams that were contaminated with human and animal waste. The soap was made from lye that could burn your skin, and many people developed serious skin conditions from the harsh chemicals. Shaving was dangerous because razors were often dirty and dull, leading to infections that could be fatal. Many men grew beards not for fashion, but because shaving was simply too risky. Barbers who offered shaving services often spread diseases through contaminated equipment. Even something as simple as lighting a lamp could be deadly. Kerosene was expensive and often adulterated with dangerous chemicals. Lamps regularly exploded, causing fires that burned down entire buildings. Candles were made from animal fat that gave off toxic fumes and regularly caused fires when they were knocked over. Cooking was hazardous because stoves were primitive and often faulty. Burns were common and often fatal because there was no effective treatment for severe burns. Food poisoning was epidemic because there was no refrigeration and no understanding of food safety. Sleep itself was dangerous. Beds were often infested with bedbugs, fleas, and lice that carried diseases. Mattresses were stuffed with straw or horsehair that harbored insects and vermin. Many people slept on the ground, exposing themselves to snakes, spiders, and other dangerous creatures. Personal hygiene was nearly impossible to maintain. Water for washing was scarce and often contaminated. Soap was expensive and harsh. Toothbrushes didn't exist, and dental care consisted of pulling rotten teeth with pliers. Body odor was universal, and skin diseases were common. Clothing was another source of danger. Fabrics were often treated with toxic dyes and chemicals. Wool clothing harbored lice and fleas. Leather goods were poorly tanned and often caused skin reactions. Shoes were expensive and poorly made, leading to foot problems that could become infected and life-threatening. Weather prediction was non-existent, so people were regularly caught unprepared by storms, floods, and extreme temperatures. A sudden blizzard could trap travelers and freeze them to death within hours. Flash floods could sweep away entire communities without warning. Let's look at some specific examples of frontier towns to understand just how dangerous daily life really was. Deadwood, South Dakota, was typical of gold rush towns. In its first year, 1876, the town had over 200 recorded murders in a population of fewer than 5,000 people. That's a murder rate 40 times higher than modern American cities. The streets of Deadwood were literally ankle-deep in mud, mixed with human and animal waste. Buildings were thrown together quickly with green lumber that warped and leaked. Fires were constant, and the volunteer fire department was more likely to loot burning buildings than save them. Gambling was the primary entertainment, but the games were rigged and violence was expected. Wild Bill Hickok was shot in the back while playing poker, and his death was barely noteworthy in a town where people died violently every day. The famous Number 10 saloon where Hickok died was typical of establishments where murder was just part of the atmosphere. Abilene, Kansas, was another hellhole masquerading as a cattle town. When the Texas cattle drives arrived, the town exploded in violence as cowboys, fresh from months on the trail, spent their wages on whiskey, gambling, and prostitutes. The murder rate during cattle season was astronomical. The town hired famous lawmen like Wild Bill Hickok to maintain order, but even they couldn't control the violence. Hickok himself killed several men during his tenure as marshal, and his methods were hardly what we'd consider legal today. He shot first and asked questions later, and the town council eventually fired him for being too violent. Dodge City, Kansas, was supposedly one of the more civilized frontier towns, yet it averaged about one murder per month during its peak years. The famous Boot Hill Cemetery was filled with men who died violently, most of them nameless drifters who were buried without ceremony or investigation. Even the law enforcement officers in these towns were often criminals themselves. Many sheriffs and marshals were former outlaws who took the job because it offered legal protection for their violent tendencies. Corruption was universal, and the line between lawman and criminal was often non-existent. Let's examine the reality of Native American conflicts, because Hollywood has created a completely false narrative about these encounters. The Indian Wars were genocidal campaigns designed to eliminate entire populations, and they were characterized by atrocities on all sides. Settlers lived in constant fear of raids, and that fear was justified. Entire families were wiped out, with men, women, and children killed or taken captive. The captives often faced fates worse than death, subjected to torture, sexual violence, and slavery. But the settlers were equally brutal in their treatment. Of Native Americans, massacre was common, with entire villages destroyed and non-combatants killed without mercy. The famous massacres at Sand Creek and Wounded Knee were just the most documented examples of systematic slaughter. The U.S. Army's scorched earth tactics deliberately targeted civilian populations, destroying food supplies, burning villages, and driving people into starvation. Biological warfare was used, with smallpox-infected blankets deliberately distributed to spread disease among native populations. Individual encounters were equally brutal. Scalping was practiced by both sides, and torture was common. Captives were often mutilated, burned alive, or subjected to slow, agonizing deaths. The frontier was littered with the remains of people who had been killed in ways that defy description. The psychological toll of living in constant fear of violent death cannot be overstated. Many settlers developed what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, but there was no understanding of mental health issues and no treatment available. People simply went insane from the stress and violence of daily life. Alcoholism was epidemic because drinking was one of the few ways to cope with the horror of frontier existence. The whiskey was often toxic, but people drank it anyway because the alternative was facing reality, sober. Many people drank themselves to death. And alcohol-related violence was constant. Suicide was common, but rarely recorded because of the social stigma attached to it. People facing starvation, disease, or financial ruin often chose death over continued suffering. The isolation and hopelessness of frontier life drove many people over the edge. Let's talk about the mining camps, because these were some of the most dangerous places in the Wild West. Gold and silver rushes attracted thousands of desperate people to remote locations where law and order were non-existent. The work itself was incredibly dangerous. Cave-ins killed miners regularly, and the primitive safety equipment offered little protection. Explosions from black powder were common, often killing or maiming multiple workers at once. Toxic gases in the mines caused slow, agonizing deaths from lung disease, but the real danger came from the human element. Mining camps were filled with claim jumpers, thieves, and murderers who would kill for a few dollars worth of gold dust. Disputes over claims were settled with bullets, and the lucky prospectors who actually found gold often didn't live to enjoy their wealth. Prices of basic necessities were astronomical in mining camps because everything had to be transported over. Dangerous terrain at great expense. A single egg might cost $50 in today's money, and many miners starved to death despite having pockets full of gold. The boom and bust nature of mining meant that camps would spring up overnight and disappear. Just as quickly, people would invest everything in getting to a camp, only to find that the gold had already played out, and they were stranded in the middle of nowhere with no way to get home. Placer mining involved standing in ice-cold water for hours at a time, often leading to frostbite, pneumonia, and other cold-related illnesses. Hard rock mining required working underground in spaces that were hot, poorly ventilated, and constantly threatening to collapse. Mercury poisoning was common among miners who used quicksilver to separate gold from ore. The mercury would accumulate in their bodies over time, causing neurological damage, insanity, and death. Many miners developed what was called the shakes, losing control of their motor functions as the mercury destroyed their nervous systems. Let's examine the cattle drives, another romanticized aspect of the Wild West that was actually a death sentence for many participants. Cowboys faced constant dangers from stampedes, severe weather, hostile encounters, and simple accidents. Stampedes were terrifying events that could happen without warning. A sudden noise, flash of lightning, or even the smell of a predator could cause thousands of cattle to run blindly in panic. Cowboys caught in stampedes were trampled to death or crushed against rocks and trees. River crossings were particularly dangerous because cattle could panic in the water and cowboys could be swept away by strong currents. Many drovers drowned trying to control frightened cattle in swollen rivers. The weather on the Great Plains was extreme and unpredictable. Thunderstorms could produce hail the size of baseballs, lightning that killed men and animals instantly, and tornadoes that destroyed everything in their path. Cowboys had no shelter and no warning of approaching storms. The work was physically exhausting and never-ending. Cowboys worked 18-hour days in the saddle, often going without proper sleep for days at a time. Exhaustion led to accidents, and accidents on the frontier were often fatal. Food on cattle drives was terrible even by frontier standards. Beans, hardtack, and coffee were the staples, supplemented occasionally by beef from cattle that had died or been injured. Scurvy was common, and many cowboys developed severe nutritional deficiencies. Violence was common on cattle drives because tensions ran high among men who were exhausted, hungry, and armed. Arguments over pay, working conditions, or simple personality conflicts regularly ended in gunfights. The cook was often the most dangerous man on the drive because his decisions about food could mean the difference between life and death for the entire crew. Accidents were constant and usually serious. Cowboys were thrown from horses, trampled by cattle, injured by ropes, and hurt in falls. With no medical care available, a broken bone or serious cut could become infected and kill someone within days. Let's look at homesteading, the pursuit of the American dream that became a nightmare for thousands of families. The Homestead Act of 1862 promised free land to anyone willing to settle and farm it. But the reality was far different from the promise. The land available for homesteading was usually marginal at best. Areas that were too dry, too cold, or too isolated for successful farming. The government didn't give away good land. They gave away land that nobody else wanted. Homesteaders faced complete isolation, often living dozens of miles from the nearest neighbor. If someone got sick or injured, there was no help available. Entire families died from disease, accidents, or violence with no one knowing about it until their bodies were discovered months or years later. The climate on the Great Plains was brutal and unpredictable. Droughts could last for years, destroying crops and killing livestock. Grasshopper plagues could devour entire harvests in days. Blizzards could trap families in their homes for weeks at a time. Sod houses, the typical homesteader dwelling, were damp, dirty, and infested with insects and vermin. The roofs leaked, the walls crumbled, and the floors were dirt. Families lived in conditions that would be considered uninhabitable today. Water was often scarce and usually contaminated. Homesteaders had to dig wells by hand, often going down hundreds of feet before finding water. The water they found was frequently alkaline, contaminated with minerals or polluted with animal waste. Fuel for heating and cooking was scarce on the treeless plains. Homesteaders burned buffalo chips, corn cobs, and anything else they could find. Many families froze to death during severe winters because they couldn't maintain fires to heat their homes. The isolation and hardship drove many homesteaders insane. Prairie madness was a real phenomenon, with people developing severe mental illness from the stress, isolation, and hopelessness of frontier life. Many homesteaders committed suicide rather than continue struggling to survive. Financial failure was almost inevitable for most homesteaders. The initial investment required for tools, seed, and livestock was substantial, and most families went into debt to get started. Crop failures, livestock disease, and falling prices could wipe out years of work in a single season. Even successful homesteaders lived lives of constant toil and hardship. They worked from sunrise to sunset every day of the year, with no vacations, no entertainment, and no relief from the grinding routine of survival. Let's examine the transportation networks that connected these isolated communities, because travel itself was a deadly undertaking. Stagecoaches were the primary means of long-distance travel, but they were dangerous, uncomfortable, and unreliable. Stagecoach robberies were common, and passengers were often killed even when they cooperated with the robbers. The coaches themselves were poorly built and maintained, regularly breaking down in remote areas where passengers could die of exposure or thirst. The roads, such as they were little more than trails marked by wagon ruts. They washed out in storms, became impassable in winter, and were blocked by fallen trees, rock slides, and other obstacles. Getting stuck in remote areas often meant death. Accidents were frequent and usually serious. Coaches overturned regularly, throwing passengers out and sometimes crushing them. Horses panicked and ran away with coaches, leading to crashes that killed everyone aboard. River ferries were primitive affairs that regularly sank, drowning passengers and destroying their possessions. Many ferries were operated by criminals who robbed passengers or held them for ransom. Railroad construction was one of the most dangerous occupations in America. Workers were killed in explosions, cave-ins, and industrial accidents at an appalling rate. The Central Pacific Railroad lost an estimated 1,200 Chinese workers during construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, and their bodies were often left where they fell. Even completed railroads were dangerous. Derailments were common because of poor construction, inadequate maintenance, and primitive safety systems. Boiler explosions killed passengers and crew regularly. Train robberies were frequent, and passengers were often murdered by bandits. The famous Pony Express lasted only 18 months, partly because it was so dangerous that they couldn't keep riders. Many Pony Express riders were killed by hostile tribes, bandits, or simply accidents in the wilderness. The job paid well because few people were willing to risk their lives for it. Telegraph lines were constantly cut by hostile tribes, outlaws, or simple vandalism. The men who maintained these lines worked alone in dangerous territory, and many simply disappeared, presumably killed by the various threats they faced daily. Let's look at some specific diseases that decimated frontier populations. Because medical ignorance killed more people than all the gunfights and Indian raids combined. Cholera was perhaps the most feared disease because it could kill healthy adults within hours of the first symptoms. Cholera spread through contaminated water supplies, and frontier communities had no understanding of sanitation or water purification. Entire towns would be wiped out in a matter of days when cholera arrived. The symptoms were horrific: violent diarrhea, vomiting, and dehydration that left people looking like living skeletons before they died. Smallpox was another killer that swept through communities regularly. The disease was highly contagious and often fatal, leaving survivors horribly scarred and sometimes blind. There was no treatment, and isolation was the only way to prevent its spread. Tuberculosis was called the White Death because it slowly consumed its victims over months or years. The disease was highly contagious and thrived in the overcrowded, poorly ventilated conditions common in frontier towns. Entire families would be wiped out as the disease spread from person to person. Typhoid fever spread through contaminated food and water, causing high fever, delirium, and often death. The disease was common in areas with poor sanitation, which described most of the frontier. Pneumonia killed thousands of people every winter, especially children and elderly adults. There were no antibiotics, no oxygen therapy, and no understanding of how to treat the disease. People simply died, gasping for breath, while their families watched helplessly. Dysentery was so common that it was considered normal, but it killed thousands of people through dehydration and complications. The disease spread through contaminated water and food, and frontier communities had no effective way to prevent or treat it. Even minor injuries could become fatal infections. A simple cut could develop gangrene, requiring amputation or leading to death. Broken bones often healed improperly, leaving people crippled for life. Burns from cooking fires or oil lamps often became infected and killed their victims slowly and painfully. Childbirth was extraordinarily dangerous for both mothers and babies. With no understanding of sterile procedures, no pain relief, and no way to handle complications, many women died in agony during labor. Infant mortality was so high that many communities didn't bother keeping accurate records. Mental health was completely misunderstood, and people with mental illness were often chained up, locked away, or simply abandoned. There was no treatment for depression, anxiety, or other mental health conditions, and many people committed suicide rather than continue suffering. Let's examine the economic systems that trapped people in cycles of poverty and desperation. Company. Stores in mining and logging camps charged exorbitant prices for basic necessities, keeping workers in perpetual debt. A miner might work for months and still owe money to the company store at the end. Sharecropping systems in agricultural areas were designed to keep farmers in debt slavery. Landowners provided seed, tools, and supplies on credit, then took most of the crop as payment. Sharecroppers rarely made enough to pay off their debts and were trapped in the system for life. Banking was primitive and unreliable. Banks failed regularly, wiping out depositors' life savings. There was no government insurance or regulation, and corrupt bankers often simply stole depositors' money and fled to other territories. Currency was a confusing mixture of gold, silver, paper money from various banks, and privately issued tokens. Counterfeiting was common, and many people lost their savings to worthless fake money. Credit was expensive when it was available at all. Interest rates of 25 to 50% were common, and failure to pay debts could result in imprisonment or worse. Many people worked their entire lives without ever getting out of debt. Price manipulation was common in isolated communities. Merchants could charge whatever they wanted because there was no competition and no way for customers to shop elsewhere. A bag of flour might cost 10 times what it cost in established cities. Land speculation created boom and bust cycles that ruined thousands of families. Speculators would drive up land prices artificially, then sell out before the bubble burst, leaving ordinary settlers holding worthless property. Employment was uncertain and seasonal. Many jobs lasted only a few months, leaving workers unemployed and destitute for most of the year. There was no unemployment insurance or social safety net of any kind. Wage theft was common, with employers simply refusing to pay workers or paying them in worthless scrip that could only be used at company stores. Workers had no legal recourse and often had to accept whatever payment they were offered. Let's talk about the justice system in more detail, because it was often more dangerous than the criminals it was supposed to control. Vigilance committees were essentially lynch mobs that operated under the pretense of maintaining law and order. These groups regularly hanged innocent people based on suspicion, prejudice, or personal grudges. The famous vigilantes of Montana hanged at least 21 people in a few months during 1863-1864, and many historians believe some of the victims were innocent. The committees operated in secret, with hooded members who could murder someone and never face consequences. Judges were often unqualified political appointees who knew little about law and cared less about justice. Many were corrupt, taking bribes to influence verdicts or simply ruling in favor of whoever paid them more. Juries could be intimidated, bribed, or packed with friends of the accused or the victim. A fair trial was nearly impossible in communities where everyone knew everyone else, and old grudges influenced every decision. Even legitimate law enforcement officers were often little better than the criminals they pursued. Many sheriffs and marshals were former outlaws who took the job for the legal protection it offered. Corruption was universal, and the badge was often just a license to commit crimes with impunity. Prison conditions were horrific when prisons existed at all. Most frontier jails were little more than holes in the ground or crude wooden buildings that provided no protection from weather or vermin. Prisoners were often chained to walls, fed spoiled food, and left to die from disease or neglect. Executions were public spectacles that drew crowds of bloodthirsty spectators. Hangings were often botched, leaving the condemned to strangle slowly while crowds cheered. Many people were executed for crimes that would merit probation today. The legal system was particularly harsh toward minorities. Native Americans, Mexicans, Chinese immigrants, and African Americans faced systematic discrimination and were often denied basic legal rights. They could be murdered with little fear of legal consequences for the perpetrators. Women had virtually no legal rights and could be beaten, raped, or murdered by their husbands with little chance of legal recourse. Domestic violence was considered a private matter, and wives were essentially property of their husbands. Let's examine the educational system, or lack thereof, because ignorance was both a cause and effect of frontier violence. Most frontier communities had no schools at all, and illiteracy rates were astronomical. Children grew up without basic education, making them easy targets for con artists and criminals. The few schools that existed were primitive one-room affairs, where a single teacher tried to educate children of all ages simultaneously. Teachers were often unqualified and sometimes barely literate themselves. Many teachers were men who had failed at other occupations and saw teaching as a last resort. School discipline was brutal, with teachers using corporal punishment liberally. Children were beaten with sticks, straps, and whatever else was handy. Some teachers were sadists who seemed to enjoy inflicting pain on their students. Violence was common in schools, both from teachers and from older students who bullied younger ones mercilessly. Many children were seriously injured or even killed in school fights, and there was little adult supervision or intervention. Education for girls was considered unnecessary and often forbidden. Most girls received no formal education beyond basic reading and arithmetic, if that. Higher education was completely out of reach for the vast majority of the population. Books were expensive and scarce. Most frontier communities had no libraries, and many families owned no books at all. Newspapers were irregular and often weeks or months out of date by the time they arrived. Technical and professional education was non-existent. Doctors, lawyers, and other professionals learned by apprenticeship or trial and error. Many practitioners were completely unqualified, leading to countless deaths from medical malpractice and legal incompetence. Let's look at the role of alcohol. in frontier society, because drinking was both a cause and symptom of the violence and desperation that characterized daily life. Alcoholism was epidemic, with many people drinking themselves to death as the only escape from the horror of their existence. The alcohol itself was often toxic. Frontier whiskey was frequently adulterated with wood alcohol, tobacco juice, and other poisonous substances to increase profits. Many people died from methanol poisoning or other toxins in their drinks. Saloons were centers of violence where arguments regularly ended in gunfights. The combination of alcohol, gambling, and armed men created an explosive mixture that claimed hundreds of lives. Even innocent bystanders were often killed in drunken brawls. Drunk driving wasn't a concept, but drunk riding was just as dangerous. Intoxicated men regularly fell from horses, drove wagons off cliffs, or simply passed out in the wilderness and froze to death. Alcohol-related accidents were a major cause of death. Domestic violence increased dramatically when men were drinking, and there was no legal protection for wives and children. Many women and children were beaten to death by drunken husbands and fathers, with no legal consequences for the perpetrators. Alcohol was often the only anesthetic available for medical procedures. Patients would be given whiskey before surgery, amputation, or other painful treatments. Many died from alcohol poisoning before the medical procedure could even begin. The economic impact of alcoholism was devastating. Men would spend their entire wages on drinking, leaving their families to starve. Businesses failed because workers were too drunk to perform their jobs effectively. Prohibition movements in frontier communities often led to violence between wets and dries. Towns were literally torn apart by conflicts over alcohol, with shootings, riots, and other violence becoming common. Let's examine the treatment of minorities in the Wild West, because prejudice and racism made life even more dangerous for anyone who wasn't a white male. Chinese immigrants faced systematic persecution, violence, and discrimination that made their lives a constant struggle for survival. Anti-Chinese violence was common and often fatal. Entire Chinese communities were burned out, with residents murdered or driven away. The Rock Springs Massacre of 1885 saw white miners murder 28 Chinese workers and wound 15 others, then burn down the Chinese section of town. Chinese workers were forced to take the most dangerous jobs at lower pay than white workers. They built railroads through mountains using explosives and primitive tools, with hundreds dying in accidents that could have been prevented with proper safety measures. Mexican Americans faced similar persecution, especially in areas that had been part of Mexico before the Mexican-American War. Their land was often stolen through legal manipulation, and they were treated as second-class citizens in their ancestral homeland. African Americans in the West faced the same racism they encountered elsewhere, plus additional dangers from frontier violence. Black cowboys, soldiers, and settlers were regularly murdered simply because of their race, with little chance of legal justice. Native Americans faced genocidal policies designed to eliminate them entirely. The reservation system was designed to concentrate tribes on marginal land where they would slowly starve to death. Those who resisted were hunted down and killed like animals. The buffalo slaughter was deliberately designed to destroy the Plains Indians' way of life. Professional hunters killed millions of buffalo, leaving the carcasses to rot while taking only the hides. This environmental destruction was a form of warfare designed to force Native Americans onto reservations. Interracial relationships were dangerous for all involved. Mixed-race couples faced violence from both sides, and their children were often rejected by all communities. Many were forced to live in complete isolation to avoid persecution. Let's look at some specific examples of how ordinary activities that we take for granted today could be fatal in the Wild West. Getting a haircut was risky because barbers used Dirty instruments that spread diseases like hepatitis and syphilis. Many barbers doubled as surgeons and dentists, performing procedures with no medical training. Going to church wasn't safe because religious buildings were often targets for robbery and violence. Many churches were burned down by arsonists, and congregations were sometimes attacked during services. Religious conflicts between different denominations sometimes turned violent. Shopping for supplies was dangerous because stores were frequent targets for robbery. Merchants were often murdered for their cash and goods, and customers could be caught in the crossfire. Many stores were located in dangerous parts of town where violence was common. Even recreational activities were deadly. Hunting was necessary for survival, but accidents were common. Many hunters were killed by wild animals, accidental shootings, or simply getting lost in the wilderness. Fishing could be dangerous due to drowning, animal attacks, or contaminated water. Dancing and social gatherings often ended in violence as men fought over women, gambling debts, or simple slights to their honor. Many barn dances and community gatherings ended with gunfights that left multiple people dead. Horse racing and other sporting events were opportunities for gambling, which inevitably led to accusations of cheating and violence. Many spectators were killed in riots that erupted when races didn't go as expected. Even attending a theater performance could be dangerous. Theaters were often rough establishments where violence was common. The famous assassination of President Lincoln in Ford's Theater was just the most notable example of theater violence. Let's examine the role of firearms in daily life, because guns were both essential tools and constant threats. Everyone was armed because it was necessary for survival, but this created a society where any argument could become a deadly gunfight. Gun accidents were incredibly common because firearms were primitive and unreliable. Many people were killed by misfiring guns, accidental discharges, or weapons that exploded in their hands. Children regularly found loaded guns and accidentally killed themselves or others. Gun maintenance was poor because of the harsh frontier conditions. Weapons were often dirty, damaged, or improperly loaded, making them as dangerous to their owners as to their targets. Many gunfighters were killed by their own malfunctioning weapons. Ammunition was expensive and often unreliable. Many cartridges were duds that failed to fire when needed, leaving people defenseless at critical moments. Homemade ammunition was often more dangerous than commercially manufactured rounds. Quick-draw duels were mostly Hollywood invention, but people did kill each other in gunfights regularly. Most shootings happened at close range, often without warning and usually over trivial disputes. The idea of honorable gunfights was largely mythical. Gun laws varied widely and were often ignored or unenforced. Some towns banned firearms, but these laws were difficult to enforce and often created more problems than they solved. Many people simply ignored gun laws and faced few consequences. The psychological impact of living in an armed society cannot be overstated. People lived in constant fear of violence, and this stress contributed to mental health problems, alcoholism, and more violence. The cycle of violence fed on itself, creating communities where murder was commonplace. Let's look at the role of women in frontier society, because their experiences were particularly brutal and dangerous. Women had few legal rights and were considered property of their fathers or husbands. They could be beaten, raped, or killed with little legal recourse. Pregnancy and childbirth were death sentences for many women. With no understanding of sanitation, no pain relief, and no way to handle complications, maternal mortality rates were astronomical. Many women died in agony while giving birth, and their babies often died with them. Women who traveled alone were assumed to be prostitutes and treated accordingly. Rape was common and rarely prosecuted, especially if the victim was poor or from a minority group. Many women were killed simply because they were vulnerable targets. Domestic violence was accepted as normal, and wives had no legal protection from abusive husbands. Many women were beaten to death by their spouses, and the authorities rarely investigated these deaths as crimes. Women's work was dangerous and exhausting. Cooking over open fires regularly caused fatal burns. Hauling water and doing laundry by hand caused serious injuries. Many women died from exhaustion and overwork. The few jobs available to women were often dangerous and poorly paid. Domestic servants faced sexual assault and violence from employers. Factory workers faced dangerous machinery and toxic chemicals. Seamstresses developed lung diseases from textile dust. Women who lost their husbands were often left destitute with no way to support themselves and their children. Many were forced into prostitution or begging to survive. Widows and orphans had no social safety net and often died of starvation or exposure. Even respectable women lived lives of constant hardship and danger. They were expected to bear multiple children despite the high mortality risk. They worked from dawn to dusk without modern conveniences or help. Their lives were short, brutal, and largely unrecorded by history. Let's examine the environmental challenges that made the West so dangerous, because nature itself was trying to kill settlers. Droughts could last for years, destroying crops and killing livestock. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s had precedence in earlier droughts that wiped out entire communities. Floods were equally devastating, washing away homes, livestock, and people. Flash floods could appear without warning, trapping people in canyons or low-lying areas. Many settlements were built in flood-prone areas because people didn't understand the risks. Tornadoes were terrifying forces of destruction that could level entire towns in minutes. With no warning systems and no safe shelters, people were completely vulnerable to these storms. Many communities were repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt. Wildfires were constant threats that could spread rapidly across the dry landscape. Entire forests and grasslands would burn, destroying everything in their path. Many settlers were trapped by fires and died horrible deaths. Earthquakes were particularly dangerous in mining areas where underground excavations made the ground unstable. Mine collapses caused by earthquakes killed thousands of workers who had no warning and no escape routes. Extreme temperatures were killers in both summer and winter. Heat waves could cause fatal heat stroke within hours, while cold snaps could freeze people to death in their homes. Many people died simply because they couldn't maintain adequate heating or cooling. Insect plagues were devastating to crops and dangerous to humans. Locusts could devour entire harvests in days, leaving families to starve. Mosquitoes spread malaria and yellow fever. Ticks carried Rocky Mountain spotted fever and other deadly diseases. Venomous snakes and spiders were constant threats, especially in desert areas. Many people died from snake bites because there was no effective treatment available. Spider bites could cause painful deaths from necrosis and systemic poisoning. Large predators like bears, mountain lions, and wolves regularly attacked humans. Many settlers were killed and eaten by wild animals, especially children who wandered away from settlements. Hunting these predators was dangerous and often unsuccessful. Let's look at the economic boom and bust cycles that characterized frontier life, because financial ruin was often followed by literal death. Gold rushes created temporary prosperity that collapsed when the ore played out, leaving thousands of people stranded in remote locations with no way to get home. The California Gold Rush of 1849 attracted over 300,000 people to California, but most of them never found gold, and many died trying. The journey to California killed thousands through disease, accidents, and violence. Those who survived the trip often found that all the good claims had been taken. Silver booms in Nevada, Colorado, and other states followed similar patterns. Towns would spring up overnight when ore was discovered, then become ghost towns just as quickly when the mines played out. People who had invested everything in these booms were left with nothing. Cattle booms created temporary wealth for ranchers, but overgrazing and harsh winters could wipe out entire herds in a single season. The winter of 1886 to 1887 killed an estimated 90% of the cattle on the northern plains, bankrupting thousands of ranchers and causing widespread starvation. Railroad construction created temporary employment for thousands of workers, but the jobs ended when the lines were completed. Many railroad workers were left stranded in remote areas with no money and no way to get home. Land speculation created artificial booms that inevitably collapsed, ruining investors and settlers alike. Towns were platted and sold to investors who never saw the land, only to discover later that they had bought worthless desert or swampland. Bank failures were common and devastating. When banks collapsed, they took their depositors' life savings with them. There was no government insurance or regulation, and people who lost their money in bank failures often faced destitution and starvation. The primitive communication systems meant that news of economic changes traveled slowly, if at all. People might continue investing in failed ventures for months after they had collapsed, simply because they hadn't received the news. Let's examine the transportation of goods and people in more detail, because supply chains were fragile and dangerous. Everything had to be transported by wagon, stagecoach, or pack animal over rough terrain and through hostile territory. Freight wagons were regular targets for robbery and attack. Drivers were often killed for their cargo, and entire wagon trains sometimes disappeared without a trace. The goods that did make it through were often damaged by weather, accidents, or rough handling. The cost of transportation was enormous, making basic necessities incredibly expensive in remote areas. A single item might cost 10 times more on the frontier than in established cities, simply because of transportation costs. Spoilage was a constant problem because there was no refrigeration and transportation was slow. Food often arrived rotten or contaminated, but people ate it anyway because they had no choice. Many deaths from food poisoning could be traced to spoiled goods that had traveled too far in bad conditions. Pack animals were vulnerable to disease, predators, and accidents. When animals died, their cargo was often abandoned because there was no way to transport it further. Many supply trains were lost when their animals died or were stolen. River transportation was dangerous because of rapids, sandbars, and seasonal variations in water levels. Many boats sank, taking their cargo and passengers to the bottom. Steamboat explosions were common and usually fatal for everyone aboard. Weather could delay or destroy supply trains for weeks or months. A single blizzard could trap a wagon train and kill everyone in it. Flash floods could wash away bridges and make roads impassable for extended periods. Even when goods arrived safely, storage was a problem because warehouses were poorly constructed and inadequately protected. Fires, floods, and vermin regularly destroyed stored goods, leaving communities without essential supplies. Let's look at the specific dangers faced by different ethnic groups, because prejudice made the West even more deadly for minorities. Irish immigrants faced discrimination and violence, especially in mining communities where they were blamed for taking jobs from real Americans. Anti-Irish sentiment was so strong that many businesses posted signs saying, "No Irish need apply." Irish workers were forced to take the most dangerous jobs at lower wages, and they faced violence from nativist groups who wanted to drive them out entirely. German immigrants were generally more accepted, but they still faced discrimination and violence, especially during times of economic hardship. Many German communities were attacked by mobs who blamed them for various problems. Jewish immigrants faced religious persecution and economic discrimination. They were often blamed for economic problems and faced violence from anti-Semitic groups. Many Jewish businesses were destroyed by mobs, and Jewish families were driven from their homes. Italian immigrants were often confused with Mexicans and faced similar discrimination. They were considered racially inferior by many Americans and were excluded from many jobs and communities. The few African Americans who made it to the West faced systematic racism and violence. Black cowboys, soldiers, and settlers were regularly murdered simply because of their race, and they had little chance of legal justice. Mexican Americans found themselves strangers in their own land after the Mexican-American War. Their property was often stolen through legal manipulation, and they were treated as conquered people rather than American citizens. Native Americans faced genocidal policies designed to eliminate them entirely. The reservation system was a form of concentration camp designed to isolate and slowly exterminate entire tribes. Mixed-race individuals faced rejection from all communities and often lived in complete isolation. They were too white for Native American communities and too Indian for white communities, leaving them with no place in society. Let's examine the role of gambling in frontier society, because it was both entertainment and a deadly serious business. Gambling was one of the few forms of entertainment available, but it was also a major source of violence and death. Card games were routinely rigged, and accusations of cheating regularly led to gunfights. Professional gamblers were skilled at cheating and often killed anyone who caught them at it. Many honest players were murdered by cheating gamblers who didn't want to be exposed. Poker games could last for days, with fortunes won and lost on single hands. Men would bet everything they owned, including their horses, guns, and even their lives. Many poker games ended with multiple deaths when losers couldn't accept their losses. Faro was a popular game that was almost impossible to win because the odds were heavily stacked against players. Many people lost their life savings to crooked faro dealers, then committed suicide rather than face the consequences. Dice games were popular, but usually rigged with loaded dice or other cheating devices. Players who won too much were often accused of cheating themselves and faced violence from sore losers. Horse racing was popular, but corruption was common. Races were routinely fixed, and spectators who bet on the wrong horse often faced financial ruin. Violence frequently erupted when race fixing was discovered. Cockfighting and other animal sports were brutal spectacles that attracted gambling and violence. These events were often used as covers for other criminal activities, and participants faced both legal and physical dangers. Gambling debts were serious matters that could lead to violence or death. People who couldn't pay their gambling debts were often beaten, killed, or forced into virtual slavery to work off what they owed. Let's look at the medical practices of the time, because doctors often killed more patients than they saved. Medical training was primitive when it existed at all, and many practitioners had no formal education in medicine. Bloodletting was a common treatment for almost every ailment, and it often killed patients by causing anemia and weakness. Doctors would drain patients of large amounts of blood, believing this would cure everything from fever to broken bones. Patent medicines were popular, but often contained dangerous drugs like opium, cocaine, and alcohol. These miracle cures created armies of addicts and killed thousands of people who thought they were getting legitimate medicine. Surgery was performed without anesthesia, antiseptics, or understanding of infection control. Many patients died from the shock of surgery, blood loss, or infections that developed afterward. Amputations were common and usually fatal. Dentistry was particularly brutal, consisting mainly of pulling rotten teeth with pliers while the patient was awake. Many people died from infections that developed after dental procedures, and dental abscesses often killed people when they spread to the brain. Childbirth was handled by midwives who had no medical training and often made dangerous situations worse through ignorance. Many women died from infections, bleeding, or complications that could have been prevented with proper medical knowledge. Mental illness was completely misunderstood, and treatment often consisted of chaining patients up or locking them away. Many mentally ill people were simply abandoned or killed because they were considered dangerous or possessed by demons. Infectious diseases spread rapidly because there was no understanding of how diseases were transmitted. Doctors often spread diseases from patient to patient through contaminated instruments and poor hygiene practices. The few hospitals that existed were often more dangerous than staying home. They were dirty, overcrowded, and staffed by unqualified personnel. Many people entered hospitals with minor ailments and died from infections they caught there. Let's examine the legal profession, because lawyers were often as crooked as the criminals they were supposed to prosecute or defend. Many frontier lawyers had no formal legal training and learned by reading books and practicing on whoever would hire them. Corruption was endemic in the legal system, with judges, lawyers, and court officials taking bribes to influence verdicts. Justice went to whoever could pay the most, and poor defendants had little chance of fair treatment. Legal fees were often exorbitant, and many lawyers demanded payment in advance because they knew their clients might not survive their cases. People were often bankrupted by legal costs even when they won their cases. Contracts were difficult to enforce because courts were irregular and legal standards varied widely from place to place. Many business disputes were settled with violence, rather than legal proceedings, because the legal system was unreliable. Property rights were poorly defined and difficult to enforce. Land disputes were common and often violent, with competing claimants settling their differences with guns rather than legal documents. The few law schools that existed produced lawyers who were barely competent, and many lawyers learned their trade through apprenticeships with practitioners who were themselves unqualified. Legal records were poorly kept when they were kept at all, making it difficult to establish precedents or verify legal proceedings. Many court records were lost, destroyed, or never created in the first place. The appeals process was slow and expensive when it existed at all. People convicted of crimes often served their entire sentences or were executed before appeals could be heard. Let's look at the role of religion in frontier society, because even spiritual matters were dangerous in the Wild West. Religious conflicts between different denominations sometimes turned violent, with competing churches fighting for converts and territory. Many frontier preachers were unqualified charlatans who used religion to con people out of their money. Traveling evangelists often left town with whatever donations they could collect, leaving behind disappointed and sometimes bankrupt congregations. Religious extremism was common, with some groups practicing dangerous rituals or holding beliefs that put their members at risk. Snake handling, speaking in tongues, and other ecstatic practices sometimes resulted in serious injuries or death. Church buildings were often targets for robbery and violence because they were known to collect donations and were usually unguarded. Many churches were burned down by arsonists or destroyed in conflicts between different religious groups. Religious persecution was common, with minority faiths facing discrimination and violence from dominant groups. Catholics, Jews, Mormons, and other minorities were often attacked by Protestant majorities who considered them heretical or dangerous. Missionary work among Native Americans was often a form of cultural genocide designed to destroy traditional ways of life. Many missionaries were killed by tribes who resented their attempts to force conversion, and many Indians died from diseases spread by missionary contact. Religious services were sometimes the only social gatherings available, but they could also be dangerous because they brought together people who might have conflicts with each other. Many church services ended in violence as old grudges erupted during supposedly peaceful gatherings. The lack of qualified clergy meant that many religious services were led by unqualified individuals who might teach dangerous or heretical doctrines. Some religious leaders used their positions to exploit followers sexually, financially, or physically. As we reach the end of this examination of why you wouldn't survive a day in the Wild West, it becomes clear that every aspect of frontier life was designed to kill you. From the moment you woke up until you tried to go to sleep, assuming you lived that long, death lurked around every corner, behind every door, and in every glass of water you drank. The romantic image of cowboys and gunfighters that Hollywood has sold us is a complete fantasy. The real Wild West was a hellscape of violence, disease, ignorance, and desperation, where most people died young, poor, and forgotten. It was a place where civilization was just a thin veneer over raw human savagery, where justice came from the barrel of a gun, and where your chances of seeing another sunrise depended more on luck than skill. If you were somehow transported back to the Wild West today, you would be completely unprepared for the brutal realities of frontier life. Your modern sensibilities, your reliance on technology, your expectations of safety and security would all work against you. You would be a lamb among wolves, a civilized person thrust into a savage world where only the strongest, most ruthless, and luckiest survived. The diseases alone would probably kill you within weeks. Your immune system, accustomed to clean water, processed food, and modern sanitation, would be overwhelmed by the constant assault of cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and countless other ailments that frontier people face daily. A simple cut could become infected and kill you. A broken bone could leave you crippled for life, assuming you survived at all. The violence would shock you into paralysis. Modern people simply cannot comprehend the casual brutality that characterized daily life. In the Wild West, murder was so common that many deaths weren't even investigated. People killed each other over card games, insults, business disputes, and simple misunderstandings. The idea that life was precious was a luxury that frontier people couldn't afford. The isolation would drive you insane. Modern people are used to constant communication, instant access to information, and the knowledge that help is just a phone call away. In the Wild West, you could be completely cut off from the rest of the world for months at a time. If something happened to you, no one would know and no one would come to help. The physical demands would break your body. Frontier life required constant back-breaking labor just to survive. You would have to chop wood, haul water, tend animals, plant crops, and perform dozens of other tasks that modern people have never even attempted. The soft, sedentary lifestyle that most of us live today would leave you completely unprepared for the physical realities of frontier existence. The psychological stress would shatter your mind. Living in constant fear of death, surrounded by violence and suffering, with no hope of escape or improvement, would drive most modern people to madness or suicide. The frontier attracted and created people who were harder, more ruthless, and more desperate than anything modern society produces. Your moral sensibilities would be a fatal weakness. Modern concepts of fairness, justice, and human rights were completely foreign to frontier society. You would expect law enforcement to protect, you courts to provide justice, and society to care for the weak and helpless. These expectations would not only be disappointed, they would mark you as a victim waiting to be exploited. Your technological dependence would leave you helpless. Without GPS, you would get lost and die of exposure. Without refrigeration, you would eat spoiled food and die of poisoning. Without modern medicine, any injury or illness could kill you. Without communication technology, you would be completely isolated and vulnerable. Even your basic assumptions about how society works would be dangerous. You would expect contracts to be honored, laws to be enforced, and people to generally tell the truth. In the Wild West, These assumptions would get you killed, trusting the wrong person, believing the wrong promise, or expecting honest dealing could cost you everything, including your life. The Wild West was not a romantic adventure or a noble struggle against adversity. It was a brutal, unforgiving environment where human life was cheap and death was always just one mistake away. The people who survived were not heroes or noble pioneers. They were the ones who were willing to be more violent, more ruthless, and more desperate than their neighbors. If you think you could survive even a single day in that world, you're fooling yourself. You would be dead before sunset, killed by disease, violence, accident, or simple exposure to conditions that your modern life has left you completely unprepared to handle. The Wild West was humanity at its most brutal and primitive, and it would chew you up and spit you out without a second thought. The next time you watch a Western movie or read a romantic novel about frontier life, remember this: the real Wild West was not a place of honor, adventure, and heroism. It was a meat grinder that consumed human lives by the thousands, a savage wasteland where civilization was just a distant memory and death was the only certainty. You wouldn't survive a day there, and neither would anyone else who has been softened by the luxuries and protections of modern life. This is the truth about the Wild West that Hollywood doesn't want you to know. It was hell on earth, and you're lucky you live in a time and place where you'll never have to face its brutal realities. The pioneers who settled the American frontier paid a price in blood, suffering, and death that modern people can barely comprehend. And most of them died forgotten and alone, their dreams crushed by the savage reality of life on the edge of civilization. Be grateful that you live in an age of antibiotics, rule of law, and basic human decency, because the alternative was the Wild West, and nobody in their right mind would want to survive there.